All right, we can talk a little bit about the concept of a thought experiment. Thought experiments are going to be very important for us in this course. And the reason for that is that thought experiments are commonly used to test philosophical theories. So we already noted earlier that philosophical theories attempt to explain how it's possible, or perhaps why it's not possible, for a concept to apply by identifying the conditions for applying it, the necessary and sufficient conditions for its application. So thought experiments are important because they're used very frequently by philosophers to test these theories by determining whether the conditions which are identified by the theory are in fact necessary and sufficient for the application of the concept. So a thought experiment describes a possible situation in which a concept should apply if the theory being tested is true. So the concept of knowledge, for example, or the concept of free will will have certain conditions for its application specified by a given theory. And we're going to imagine a possible scenario and see whether those conditions that the theory says need to be satisfied are in fact necessary for the concept to apply, for example. So thought experiments generate data in the form of judgments or of a certain kind, what are called intuitions or intuitive judgments. These are non-reflective judgments, not the kinds of judgments that people make when they think consciously and they deliberate for a long time, but sort of they're a more or less automatic or immediate response to thinking about a certain situation. So in connection with this, thought experiments are often described as what are called intuition pumps. This is a phrase due to the philosopher Dan Dennett, who incidentally is not a very big fan of thought experiments, but that's not to the point for the moment. The notion of an intuition pump, I think, is handy here as a way of describing what a thought experiment is. So thought experiments are used to test the predictions of philosophical theories. So let's consider an example of how this might work. So consider the following theory of knowledge. We'll call this the TB theory. So someone, call that person X, knows that P, so P is some proposition, if and only if X believes that P, and P happens to be true. So we might try to test this theory, the TB theory, by imagining a situation in which someone satisfies those conditions laid out by the theory. That is, the person believes that P, and in fact that claim that they believe is true, and ask, well, is it the case that the person knows that P, or do they actually know that P is true? That is believing that something is true and that thing's being true sufficient for knowing that that thing is true? So if this theory that we're considering is in fact correct, then the answer that people should find intuitive or intuitively correct is yes. So that's the prediction the theory makes, and now we can test this. So we might test this by considering the following scenario. We'll call this the stopped clock scenario. So imagine there's a clock that you happen to know from prior experience to be highly reliable. It's a very good device for measuring time. And you look at it one day and you notice that the clock reads 2:13 p.m. And this, in fact, is the correct time. It is at the point that you look at it, 2:13 p.m. However, unbeknownst to you, the battery in the clock ran out, and exactly 24 hours earlier, the clock stopped. So the question that we're asked here is, do you know what time it is? Right? You believe that it's 2:13 p.m., and it is in fact 2:13 p.m. But do you know that it's 2:13 p.m.? The theory predicts that you do in fact know what time it is, but most people, when they think about this situation and consider the question of knowledge, come to a different conclusion and say, well, you don't know what time it is in that case, despite the fact that you believe the time to be what the clock says, and that is in fact what the time is. So the standard result of this experiment suggests that the theory is false. It generates a false prediction about how people will judge this scenario. The second example, and this is an example which we'll come back to later on, has to do with ethical theory. And so there's a theory in ethics called utilitarianism. We'll talk about it a fair bit later on. And it says that an action is morally right if and only if that action produces the greatest good for the greatest number. As it were, it sort of maximizes the welfare of people in the aggregate. And the theory also says that all that matters to the moral status of an action, the rightness or wrongness of an action, is the outcome or the consequences or results of the actions being performed. So you might think about this as the idea that the end justifies the means. Now consider the following thought experiment. The thought experiment actually has two parts. Now this is called the runaway trolley thought experiment. And the first part of it goes like this. There's a trolley rushing down the track. It's out of control. And if it continues running down the track on the path that it's on, it's going to kill a number of people who have been tied to the track. So there are 5 people on the track. Now you witness this, and you notice that it's possible by throwing a switch to divert the trolley car to a side track. And in the course of diverting it, you will then save the 5 people tied to the main track, but on the side track there's 1 person. So the question that we're gonna think about is, should you throw the switch? Most people, when they think about this sort of situation, say yes, you should throw the switch, or at a minimum they say yes, it's okay to throw the switch. So that's the first part of the thought experiment involving the trolley. And we might justify the judgment here that it's appropriate to throw the switch by just noting that, if people are going to die, it's less bad for 1 person to die than 5. So, or if you like, killing 1 person is less bad than letting 5 people die. Now, in the alternative version of this thought experiment, which is sometimes called the footbridge case, or the footbridge variant, there's only 1 track, there's no side track, but instead of the side track, there's a bridge, a footbridge that goes over the main track. And on this footbridge, there's a very large man. Now, the same situation applies with respect to the trolleys being out of control. It's running down the track, and if it's not stopped, it's going to kill these 5 people. There's no switch to pull, there's no sidetrack, but if you push the large man off the footbridge, he will fall, and in virtue of his falling, he will stop the trolley from hitting the 5. He will be killed in the process. The idea being that he has sufficient inertial mass to stop the progress of the trolley, but that will result in his death. Now, most people, when they're presented with this kind of scenario and would ask something like, would you push the fat man off the bridge, or do you think it would be okay to push the fat man off the bridge? Most people say no. And this is a bit perplexing, right? Because we might have thought, given the previous example, that killing 1 person is less bad than letting 5 people die. That's what we had from the switch variant that we looked at just a moment ago. So we run ourselves into a certain kind of conflict here. Now, we can analyze this sort of situation along the following lines in terms of the upshot for the theory that we're looking at, this philosophical theory of right action called utilitarianism. The analysis goes something like this. If utilitarianism is correct, then the first case, the switch case, is morally equivalent to the second case, the footbridge case, because the outcomes are the same, right? It's 5 people versus 1 person in both cases. So they're absolutely symmetric, these 2 cases, from the perspective of the outcomes, from the utilitarian perspective. So if utilitarianism is correct as a philosophical theory, it predicts that people should have the same intuition about what to do in both cases. That is to say, if they think that it's okay to throw the switch, they should also think that it's okay to push the man off the bridge. If they think that it's not okay to throw the switch, then they should also think it's not okay to push the man off the bridge. But what we find is, in fact, that most people, the overwhelming majority of people, have different intuitions about these 2 cases. The overwhelming majority of people, something, upwards of 80% of the people, will say yes to the first scenario, yes to throwing the switch. But those same people will say no to pushing the man off the bridge. And what this means then is that this theory of right action, utilitarianism, makes the wrong prediction. And that's a mark against the theory. So we can see how this thought experimental method then gives us a reason to worry about the correctness of the theory in question.